Good morning, everyone. Wow, what an incredibly hard act to follow from my inspiring cohort this morning. 2 years ago, I began my Nuffield farming journey to investigate whether anti-farming sentiment is increasing globally and to come up with a plan, if so, to turn that around. This week, we saw around 15,000 individuals take to the streets of London concerned about the future of farming. This was a reminder to me that this topic is incredibly important, and I can promise you it was not part of a wider publicity stunt to promote my presentation. I can assure you that I did not have that knowledge 2 years ago. But over the last decade that I've been working in the media, I noticed a tone change, a change of tone, not only in farming, but in wider society. Climate change rose to the top of government agendas. Food security appeared to take a backseat, and agricultural practices came increasingly under the microscope. Questions were being asked at farmers, and many felt their way of life and their identity was being challenged. I kept hearing three things. The media are out to get us, the public is disconnected, and the government doesn't care. So I set off around the world to understand how perceptions and expectations of agriculture are changing and how we all are collectively responding to scrutiny. As David said, I've had quite a journey. I have been across 6 continents into 16 countries. I've spent over 9 months immersing myself in different conversations, communities, and cultures. And I've been fortunate enough to have over 500 engagements along the way. My brain is still spinning as I digest through some of that. I've met with farmers, lobbying bodies, government ministers, journalists, researchers, agronomists, vets, campaigners, lots of advocates, and everybody in between. And to give you a bit of a flavor of my travels, I went to Brazil, where conversations that came up yesterday around deforestation were very prominent, but I wanted to really look at the nuance and the wider story behind that. I went to countless feedlots from Brazil to Australia, from Japan to Indonesia. Feedlots are often at the receiving end of criticism. I spent time in New Zealand, Argentina, and the Netherlands, places where recently government policies have really been felt to threaten the viability of farming. I spent time in most countries around the world where water is a really significant conversation. Maybe not in Scotland, where I'm from, but it is everywhere else, and it's very contentious, particularly within agricultural communities. But I could spend time today on this stage, and I could talk to you about these examples, but really, what practical worth would this add to the industry if I just came back with the challenges? What I need to look at is how we are responding to that scrutiny and to have a think about our communication and our advocacy efforts moving forward. And I pose the following question to every single individual that I met on my travels. How is agriculture responding to scrutiny? Defensive, blinkered, blame, divided. Agriculture is on the defensive. Our messaging has become fragmented. We're often working in silos, and we're pointing the blame. We're pointing the blame at other countries, at other individuals, and at other practices. A rethink is needed in the way we engage, the way that we take people on a journey, the way we build trust, the way that we connect out with our echo chambers, and the way that we think not to work in silos, but in harmony. And as I traveled, I met with some amazing individuals, and I wish I could share all of them with you today, and I can't. But the first time that I felt real hope was when I was in Africa. I met Riva Chiramuta, a wonderful young Zimbabwean journalist, operating in a country which, 1, is incredibly dangerous for journalists to operate, and 2, a country with agricultural negatives often very negative. Riva was incredibly frustrated that there was so much negativity directed at agriculture. So she decided to set up an online magazine, as you can see here, Zim Agrit Chronicle, and her messaging is only positive. She shares the innovations and the developments that are happening in a thriving industry, which we often don't hear about. She has changed the tone of conversation. She's inspired young people to see a future in agriculture, which otherwise they did not. Ruva has gone on to become not only one of the best-known journalists in Zimbabwe, but across agriculture, because she did something different. She changed, she turned the tide on some of the anti-farming sentiment being directed that way. Then I'll take you to Tanzania, where I met with this amazing individual, Miasi Molo. Miasi is part of the Maasai community. I know many of you will know the Maasai, but those who don't, it's a nomadic community. And well, not all are nomadic now, but traditionally nomadic. They have huge herds of cattle, and they're roaming around the country in search of pastures and water, because a lot of those cattle don't enter the food chain. This is leading to conflict, particularly in conservation areas, and I visited Grumeti National Park, and it's also leading degraded soils in their path. Miasi knew something had to change. So Miasi went and he got an education around regenerative farming. And I'm not going to talk about regenerative farming, but I'm going to talk about his method of communication. Because he recognized that the biggest barrier he had, and we can all relate to, is mindset change. And he wanted to go back to his community, and he realized, I've now got an education, and I'm no longer boots on the ground and able to really engage. So he brought his mother, in the middle of Miasi and I, Martha, on board. Martha is at the heart of her Maasai community. He shared with Martha his learnings, and she, together with him, have set up a demonstration farm. And they're doing training workshops of women, specifically women in their local Maasai communities. And they're working not to preach regenerative farming, but to work alongside them. This is a grassroots movement. And I remember Miasi saying to me one day, and it's really impacted me, if you want to speak to a fish, send a fish and not a snake. Then we go to Kenya, and I visited Kakuzi Farms, a very impressive 14,000-hectare farming and commercial forestry operation. Now, during the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, there was a human rights scandal they got embroiled in. There was over 200 allegations made of human rights abuse on their farm. This led to mass international headlines. Supermarkets globally revoked their contracts, and here in the UK, their reputation was almost in ruins. Moving forward, it was discovered this was part of a trap. To discredit their reputation, bribes were made, and it was to really split up the land into smaller parcels. But the damage was done. Their reputation was, like I said, almost in tatters. But what did they do moving forward? They took on something very unique in Africa. They took on a full transparency approach, and they committed to publicizing every single misdemeanor or accident that happened on the farm, a farm of over 3,000 employees, and they set an action plan of how they were going to get on top of that and take real accountability. And moving forward slowly but surely, this was very brave. Supermarkets came back on board. They built their reputation of integrity and trust, but what they did was they were able to control the narrative. And this has meant that in future, nobody else can tell their story. Now, as I travel, people always say to me, where in the world is doing it best? Where is telling the most positive story about agriculture? And I say it's not a country, it's a sector. Agritourism. A lot of you will be thinking, agritourism, well, it's an opportunity to diversify your income streams, make space for the next generation. There's a benefit that I think is massively overlooked. And it is the service that it does to our wider industry, connecting those who are no longer connected to our land and the people that work it. They do a duty on behalf of all of us in agriculture, which I sometimes don't think is always recognized. And I've been to Tasmania, to Tanzania, seeing wonderful agritourism businesses. But collectively, I'm very proud to say, the movement that I think has done the most is in Scotland. And the reason for that is there is a woman in this room, a Nuffield scholar, who's at the heart of that movement, Caroline Miller, who has poured her heart and soul into driving that industry, showing real leadership. And our reputation for Scotland and agritourism is spread around the world, and it's even reached the fields of Zimbabwe. It's inspired Ruva, who told me when I met her, unprompted, is a subscriber to the monthly Scottish agritourism newsletter. And now Ruva is inspiring and helping farmers in Zimbabwe to enter into agritourism. Now I just wanted an excuse to tell you one of my favorite trips in my travels was to Hobbiton. Wasn't part of my research, just very excited, big fan, mostly Lord of the Rings. But I discovered this is an amazing agritourism example because I learned all about the Alexander family. So they are a working sheep farm, but they are host to one of the world's most famous movie sets. And I went off on a journey with 40 other people on my bus. Buses are moving every 10 minutes because 500,000 people visit this incredible area. If anyone's been to Hobbiton, it is wonderful. But as I set off on this journey, TV screens on the bus, and I heard all about the custodians of that land, how they protected the national environment, a real tribute to agriculture. And I just thought, wow, who would have thought the fantasy world of J.R.R. Tolkien would go on to be one of the most remarkable PR campaigns for our industry? Now, look at you all laughing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about strong communicators. Now, love him or loathe him, Jeremy Clarkson has done a huge amount for our industry around the world. He's raised the profile. But what he's provided and why it's relevant today is a masterclass in how to communicate to connect. He uses accessible language. He finds relevance. He asks the questions that everybody wants to ask. This other gentleman here, Professor Frank Mitloner, some of you might know him in this room. He founded the Clear Center at UC Davis in California. And it's a research center which rebuffs some of the misinformation spread against the livestock industry. Similar to Clarkson, they're quite different, but similar, accessible information. And he's a scientist. He's at the intercept between science and communication, but he knows how to find relevance and how to connect. They are both experts in speaking in layman's terms. And if you take one thing from my presentation today, the term, "we need to educate the public," needs to be banished. It's entitled and it's patronizing. We don't need to educate, we need to engage. And engagement is a two-way street. Now, I couldn't come to Northern Ireland without mentioning one of the most fantastic visits on my travels. And I was here in Belfast only a few weeks ago hosting an award ceremony for the ABP Angus Youth Challenge, a fantastic youth educational program directed at 14-year-old senior pupils across all of Northern Ireland. And they're given the opportunity to delve into the food and farming sector of Northern Ireland. Along with this for a year, they're given Angus cross-calves to rear and keep the proceeds. A lot of those children have gone to reinvest that money, which is wonderful. They're also given communications training. They're given cookery classes in schools. And I met some of the finalists this year, and they've produced, 14-year-olds produced podcasts around women in farming. They've created agricultural clubs in their schools. Learning materials have ended up on the desks of Stormont and Westminster. A real legacy that they have created at a vital time in a young person's education. Now, I could list so many examples here, but we simply do not have time to hear 9 months of research. But I've sort of narrowed things down to 5 core recommendations, as I like to call the 5 C's. We've got to be more curious. We've got to be brave to be curious about those outside our own echo chambers. We've got to rethink our language and the way that we communicate. And we talk about having that social license to operate. I think first we've got to think about our social conscience before we start demanding our social license. We've got to build transparency in order to build trust and to be able to connect. And we've got to think about, and it's been a real core I've noticed in my fellow scholars' presentations, we've got to start collaborating more and getting out of those silos if we want to amplify the voice of agriculture more widely. Now, my journey here doesn't end today, like any of the scholars here in this room. And I thought, what am I going to do next? And I want to continue amplifying the voice of agriculture. And I've decided to set up my own consultancy company. You heard it here first, Advocacy Consulting. And I'm going to work with organizations and businesses on repositioning their media, their communications, and their advocacy strategies to amplify the voice of agriculture in the face of rising scrutiny. And I'm so proud that I'll be able to do that around the world, because Nuffield has taught me the importance of what we do, not just here in the UK, but globally. And I am so grateful to Nuffield because they gave me a platform to travel with real purpose. And it wouldn't have been possible without the generous support of my sponsor, the Royal Highland Agriculture Society of Scotland, and the countless other generous sponsors that stepped up and supported me to be able to do this extensive travels. But a huge thank you to my family. My mum and my brother are up supporting me today. My friends, my partner Mitch, who's in Australia. I picked him up along the way. And God, that's difficult. And I've got my lovely fellow year group who've just been the most wonderful cheerleaders in a journey that has been very difficult mentally at times. And a huge thank you to the hundreds and hundreds of people who have welcomed me into their homes, into their businesses, and have really challenged me. They've challenged my perceptions and my way of thinking. This experience has been truly life-changing. Thank you.